Only in America.
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 This week, the mental health challenges young immigrants face more often than their peers, and the barriers they face in seeking help.
And I think that the youth, the immigrant youth, are the ones changing that. And I think they're doing that by being open and sharing their stories and finding those supportive platforms to share their story.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani, and this is the 150th episode of Only in America. We've talked a bit on this podcast about the emotional weight that leaving your home country and facing trauma can cause some immigrants to carry, and even how that can affect future generations. But what we haven't talked about much is the importance of mental health care in the United States, in particular for immigrant youth. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, immigrant communities encounter challenges such as discrimination, language difficulties, less access to health care, uncertain status in the U.S., and more. These challenges, often coupled with isolation from family or other support systems back home, would be difficult for anyone to handle. Mental health education can vary both within the U.S. and across immigrants' home countries. In many cases, mental illness is stigmatized or simply not talked about. And even when people do seek care, they can run into difficulty finding providers who speak their language or have cultural understanding and competency to understand where they are coming from or what they're going through. We've seen some successful approaches when immigrant youth are able to prioritize their own mental health. Last month, MinPost reported on a youth mental health program that is gaining acceptance among the Hmong community in St. Paul, Minnesota. Lu Zhang is a school-based mental health program that has been serving Southeast Asian students and their families for a decade. They hold weekly support group meetings at schools to address mental health issues that affect students' grades, their interactions with their friends and teachers, as well as their overall health. Here's what Mary Van Her, who leads the program, said about its mission. We built a group where the girls felt like their voices were heard, they could relate to one another and strengthen each other. In other settings, they were holding back and feeling alone. This was a safe place for them to share their struggles and have confidence and build their self-esteem. Programs like this address very real needs in the community, and they signal to young immigrants the very important message that it's okay to ask for help. This is Only in America's 150th episode. As we near the end of 2020, our team wants to thank you for your support of Only in America. If you like what we are putting out on the podcast, we'd love for you to consider supporting our work as we prepare for Season 4. In this season of giving, the National Immigration Forum is trying to raise $10,000 by the end of the year. You can help us reach our goal at immigrationforum.org. Thank you.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. And from Humanity United. When humanity is united, we can bring a powerful force for human dignity.
We want to tell you about a new podcast called To See Each Other. To See Each Other is a documentary series that complicates the narrative about rural Americans and our most misunderstood and often abandoned communities. Host George Gohl, a leading grassroots organizer, travels to Michigan, Iowa, New Jersey, North Carolina, and Indiana to reveal how small-town folks are working together in fights for everything from clean water and racial justice to immigration rights and climate change. The show believes that when we see each other, we'll understand that we can never give up on each other. Subscribe to See Each Other wherever you're listening to this show.
My guest today is Luna Greenstein. Luna works at the National Alliance on Mental Illness. She's a senior content manager who runs NAMI's blog, which features personal stories of everyday Americans' mental health experiences. This includes the latest research, stories of recovery, waste and stigma, and strategies for living well with mental illness. As Luna and I discussed, many of these stories that typically have gone untold have been immigrant stories. By understanding these stories, we can get a sense of the mental health challenges that young immigrants may face more often than their peers. Stigma and other barriers to seeking help have real impacts on these communities, not to mention the effects of a lack of cultural competency among mental health providers and pervasive stereotypes. Luna and I chatted about some of the personal stories she has helped bring to light. Luna, thank you so much for joining. You probably don't know this, but I have a master's in public health, so public health issues and mental health issues I find incredibly important. So thank you for spending some time with us today.
Of course, happy to talk to you about this.
So before we jump into the substance, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I live in Washington, D.C. I work for the National Alliance on Mental Illness as their senior manager of content. And for the last 5.5 years, I've been focused on kind of the storytelling aspect of mental health and building up NAMI's storytelling platforms such as our blog to incorporate more diversity of experience and to talk more about the range of mental health issues. And I've been able to feature a few people's stories that focused on their experience as an immigrant and how it impacts their mental health. So that's how I relate back to this conversation.
So what got you interested in mental health issues to begin with?
That's a great question. I've always had an interest, and in college, I started experiencing my own mental health issues, particularly with anxiety and OCD, and I just gravitated toward mental health when I was first applying for jobs my last semester of college. And I remember seeing the position that I ended up getting for NAMI and just being like, this position is exactly what I want to do, like to a T, and just being so excited about it and just feeling like the universe aligned for me to work for NAMI. And I honestly, as like arrogant as that sounds, like I really believe that, because when I started at NAMI in 2015, like the mental health movement was starting to pick up and people were starting to talk more openly about mental health. And I've just seen this amazing evolution of the stigma and walls just coming down and people being open and being able to bring people into the movement. And it's been like such a beautiful journey for me. And I'm very passionate about what I do, and I believe in storytelling to create positive change. So it's a very rewarding job, and I'm happy to have it.
I wanted to actually talk to you a little bit about kind of why for so long mental health issues were, ignored or just ignored. I mean, that's the nicest way I think I could put it. So what led to that change over the last, 6-7 years?
I think it's been a cultural shift and also a generational shift. I think people have seen others coming out in pop culture and, celebrities and athletes come out and sharing their mental health journeys. I think, millennials, when they kind of shifted to being more open and talking about how they're feeling, I think that generational shift impacted people's willingness to talk about mental health. I think we've somewhat normalized the idea of like, oh, I'm experiencing such and such mental health issue. And then someone responding saying, oh, well, have you thought about going to see someone, a mental health professional or a counselor to talk about it? And just that conversation was started recently, like, as you said, in the last 6 or 7 years. And it's just continuously grown where it's not as much of a taboo topic anymore. And I've really seen that. And for me, it's interesting because, my whole world at NAMI is mental health. So like, I'm just so kind of desensitized to talking about mental health and mental illness all the time. But I've even seen it, when I'm reading books or watching TV shows that just really focus on mental health or mental illness, or just hearing my friends or seeing on social media, like people being open. Like I really have seen a shift. And I think it is just a big cultural change that's happened.
Well, I just have to admit to you, like on a personal level, I'm a South Asian male, Gen X, so I really struggle with talking about my feelings. So there will be no discussion of my feelings here.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. So that shift, do you feel like for the immigrant community and for immigrant youth in particular, has there been an increased awareness of mental health issues?
I think there has, but I would say that for the immigrant community and for a lot of communities of color, there is a little bit of a resistance to being open about mental health. I think there's a cultural component of shame that has been associated with talking about mental health issues for so long that it's taken longer to break down the barriers than it has for the rest of the population. And that's especially true, for the immigrant population because they exude so much strength, and strength is such a core aspect of the culture of coming here and starting fresh and being able to go through that and maintain those cultural connections to home while assimilating to U.S. culture. Like there's just so many challenges that a person has to face. And I think there's like this idea that having mental health issues is seen as a weakness. And I think it's especially true for, back to the generational differences. I think it's especially true for the older generations. And I think that the immigrant youth are the ones changing that. And I think they're doing that by being open and sharing their stories and finding those supportive platforms to share their story. So I do think it's changing, but I think they have more barriers to face than people who are not immigrants.
So do you think that there's a difference here between the stigma that is associated with mental health issues kind of within a community and then the barriers to care to address those issues? Is that the difference that you're getting at here?
There is a difference. So, I see it. Yeah, I see stigma within a community as an example of a barrier to care, one of many. So the major barriers to care are language barriers. If you can't find a mental health professional who either speaks the same language as you, or if you can't find it, they're not willing to have a translator. Lack of insurance coverage. A lot of people, when they immigrate to this country, and I'm sure you could speak to this more than me, have less insurance coverage than people who are non-immigrants. So that becomes an issue, especially because we don't have full parity between physical health coverage and mental health coverage. Honestly, one of the biggest issues, like once you get past like actually just having coverage and finding someone and being able to afford mental health care is finding the right therapist, because finding the right therapist for anyone is challenging because you have to find someone you can relate to, that you connect with. But when you add that layer of needing someone who is culturally competent and able to make your culture, background, values, and experiences a part of your treatment, makes it even harder to find the right person. However, I will say that it's so worth it. It's always worth the effort. And every person that I've talked to who is an immigrant who's gone through mental health issues, they say finding the right therapist, finding a culturally competent therapist is what makes a huge difference in their recovery and their ability to learn coping skills and to move forward in their life and live a life that they want to live.
So as you have been, for NAMI, collecting these stories, but then also it's more than collecting it, it's the sharing of them. What are the themes that you see kind of continuing to come out from these stories from immigrant youth as they are sharing their experiences?
So a few things. There's one really big theme, which is just that this is a very vulnerable and underserved population when it comes to mental health. So that's a big issue and theme. And many people who have gone through the immigration process, and this is especially true for asylum seekers, have experienced trauma. And there is research showing that, youth coming in through the asylum process have a higher risk for developing PTSD. And there was a recent study that came out from the American Psychological Association about that. And then there's also the dichotomy between, their home culture and American culture that can cause mental health challenges, which is often exacerbated for a young person who identifies more with American culture, but has a parent that identifies with their home culture and wants to see that reflected in how their child acts and talks and, who they date. And it just creates a kind of pressure to be a certain way, even though the young person may feel like they need to be more American in order to fit in. So that kind of push and pull of being pressured in different directions can cause anxiety, can cause isolation. So that's also been a theme.
And then, particularly the piece of the cultural differences even within a family or a household, how are youth overcoming those kind of in this day and age where just everything just feels so much more intense? And, obviously these days, people are in the same space, for hours on end.
Well, like I mentioned earlier, one of the big stigma related issues is that there's shame associated with mental health in certain communities. And because of that, a lot of families will tell their kid, if you have a mental health issue, you have to keep it within the family. And I think the response to that from some immigrant youth, not all, is to find spaces online that are supportive where they can be open and share their stories, or even find a support group, which is honestly such a helpful thing to do, especially given the current times and the isolation that so many people are experiencing. And a lot of support groups are available online now. And actually, NAMI has support groups all over the country. And our affiliates have transitioned most of them to being available online. So I think immigrant youth have found ways to share their story, even if they don't feel comfortable talking to their family about it.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about kind of the role and the work of NAMI on this topic. Where would you like NAMI to go in terms of helping immigrant youth address mental health issues? But even before that, what is the organization strategy now? For example, I had no idea that you had chapters across the country or affiliates across the country.
Yeah, so the NAMI kind of model is, I work for NAMI National, so we're kind of like the official NAMI, and we have 600 affiliates, which are each their own organization across the country, and also 48 state organizations, which are each their own nonprofits. And all of those 650 affiliates and state organizations manage their own programs and support groups. So we have education classes. For example, one of our signature education classes is NAMI Family to Family, which is basically for family members of people who have mental illness, just to kind of educate and give an overview of what mental illness is and how to support someone, etc. And we have our signature peer support group, which is we have NAMI Peer-to-Peer and NAMI Connection. So those are the two big ones. And you have to see what's being offered for your local affiliate. So you can find that just by going to NAMI.org and find your local affiliate, and they'll have all of that information on their own website. But essentially, our model has been to try to outreach as much as possible to everyone, every community. We're trying to find people and bring people into our community. And that's especially true for those who are, part of a culture that doesn't talk about mental health and doesn't have that kind of peer support when it comes to mental health. So I think in the past, and what we've been doing even currently, has been more general in the sense of we really try to reach out to everyone, youth, people of color, just everyone under the sun. But I think what we should do, and what we probably will do in the future, is doing a little bit more of the targeted outreach of creating a program or a peer support group that specifically reaches out to different communities. But right now, all of our education classes and all of our peer support groups are open to everyone, and they're all free. They're not targeted to specific groups. So that's something that I could see happening in the future.
But also, I mean, the challenge is so large because, I would imagine that the barriers to care in some ways are very similar across immigrant communities. But I guess my question here is, are those barriers to care, whether it's personal, community, or clinical, how do they differ across communities, or do they?
I mean, the barriers to care are definitely different for immigrant communities and communities of color, because there's just these additional systemic barriers that come into play. And you also have to take into account the discrimination that people experience and the double discrimination, because if you have mental illness, even though, as I said earlier, like there has been a cultural shift, it doesn't mean that you're not going to experience discrimination. And that's especially true for someone who has a more severe mental illness. I think society is pretty on board with anxiety and depression, but for a person who experiences psychosis or disassociation or one of the less understood conditions, like they may still experience discrimination. And then if they're also an immigrant or a person of color, like they're more likely to experience discrimination from the mental health care system. Unfortunately, this is something we've seen over and over again. So there is more barriers to care for these communities.
And then, so for NAMI, you run their blog. How have you created the blog as a safe place for folks to share their stories, but also kind of learn from each other?
So, well, let me start by saying the blog is like my child. I love it. I've been working on the blog since I started at NAMI, and I've been managing it for the last 3 years, I think. Maybe, 3 years. So I've really tried to turn it into something that, as you said, is a safe space. And how I've done that is just by really opening the door of like anyone can submit a blog to me at submissions@nami.org and just tell their mental health story. And it could be, any condition, any ethnicity, like literally anything. And, I can't publish all the blogs that people submit because at this point I get way more submissions than I have space for. However, I really try to diversify the blog in the sense of like talking about those experiences that are different from the ones that you see in mainstream media. Like I don't really see a lot of articles in mainstream media talking about immigrant mental health, to be honest. So like if I get someone who wants to talk about that on the blog, I'm going to publish it because people need to see that and raise awareness. And I believe in the cycle of storytelling. So you have one person share their story and it empowers someone else to share their story. And, through that cycle, we create change and we open the conversation and we reduce stigma. And so that's really been my goal through the blog is to reach out more to the communities that are often underserved and underrepresented and have them write for the blog. And I actually do reach out to people directly, like certain organizations that, work with, let's say, like LGBTQ youth. And I'll say, like, is there anyone who wants to write a blog about LGBTQ mental health, for example? And I'll try to reach out that way. But what I've really hoped is that through publishing those stories, more people will just naturally want to write and submit to me. And I have seen that over the years, which has been really cool.
I've never heard of the idea of the cycle of storytelling, which you're absolutely correct. And people see somebody like themselves sharing a very personal story. It creates an opening.
Definitely. And I think it really raises awareness as well. It encourages people to seek help. And that's also one of my main goals is like, if you are struggling, if you are having mental health issues, find the right therapist for you, find that culturally competent therapist who's going to help you overcome those issues and learn how to cope. Because mental health issues, unfortunately, don't go away if you don't address them. That's the annoying thing about them is they just kind of stick around until you work on them. So I just want people to feel empowered to seek help no matter who they are or what their background is. I had someone share a really poignant blog in July, which is a month that we focus primarily on the intersection of race, ethnicity, culture, and mental health. And I had someone submit a blog that was like how my Latina identity holds hands with my depression. And she talked a lot about being a first generation immigrant. And it was a very beautifully written piece. And we received feedback on it saying, people saying this is me, and tagging someone and saying this is my story. And, I can't say that someone read that piece and then decided to share their story, because I don't really get that. I don't get to see that cycle, that part of the cycle continue. I just have hope that it does.
Yeah. What would you like people to take away from this conversation? What's the top thing is somebody's listening to this saying, okay, I'm going to do something differently. What would that be?
I would say be open about mental health. Share your story, even if it's just with a friend. Doesn't have to be on the internet. And encourage people and yourself to seek help when you need it.
Fantastic. So I got one more question for you.
Sure.
Name of the podcast is Only in America. So just to finish this sentence, Only in America, ...
Only in America is there so many opportunities and so many platforms to share your story.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for everything that you do and everything that folks at NAMI do. It's such important work. And there are a lot of people out there, I'm sure, who benefit from the work that you're doing, whether it's at the national level or the local level. So thank you.
Thank you. And I appreciate the work that you guys are doing at Immigration Forum. It's incredible and so important. So I'm glad to get to contribute in this small way.
Luna Greenstein is a senior content manager at the National Alliance on Mental Illness. You can learn more about the work NAMI is doing and their blog at our website, immigrationforum.org/podcast. If you like what you hear, subscribe to Only in America wherever you're listening to this episode. Only in America is produced and edited by Joanna Taylor, Megan Wetmore, and Becca Wall. Our artwork and graphics are designed by Carla Leha. I'm Ali Nirani, and I will talk to you next week.